Alara had never seen a sky that burned so brightly with fear. The alarm bells throughout the elven city echoed like the heartbeat of something dying. She ran through the stone corridors with her dragons close behind her, their claws clicking against the ancient floor as they moved. Kess, her smaller dragon with scales that shifted between crimson and gold, stayed low to the ground with her neck stretched forward. Storm, the massive blue dragon with eyes like pools of liquid mercury, kept pace effortlessly despite his enormous size. Both creatures sensed Alara's panic and matched her urgency without question. The sensors had detected massive metal objects approaching through the atmosphere, objects that did not belong to the elven world, objects that moved with the pattern of invasion craft. The High Council had been meeting for hours, debating what this meant and how to respond. Some wanted to launch defensive measures immediately. Others argued for hiding deeper underground, in the places where even their oldest records showed ancient cities buried beneath mountains of stone and ice. But Alara knew that hiding would not work. Whatever was coming, they would need to face it directly. She reached the observation chamber where the council members sat in a circle, their robes of deep purple and silver catching the light from the glowing crystals embedded in the walls. Lord Theron, the eldest among them, looked up as she entered with the dragons. His eyes were ancient and full of worry. Beside him sat Lady Miriam, her face sharp and focused, and young council member Adrian, whose hand rested nervously on the armrest of his chair. Alara bowed respectfully but did not wait for permission to speak. She moved to the crystal viewing platform and gestured toward the sky. The metal objects had become visible now, descending through the clouds in a formation that spoke of military discipline and organized purpose. They were unlike anything the elves had encountered in their long history. Their surfaces were smooth and silver, with markings that seemed to shift and change as the light hit them from different angles. Storm moved beside Alara and released a low rumble that echoed through the chamber. The sound was not aggressive but communicative. Alara had learned long ago to interpret the subtle shifts in her dragon's vocalizations. This rumble meant Storm sensed intelligence in the approaching vessels. The creatures were not mindless machines but piloted by beings with purpose and thought. Kess added her own softer chirp, and Alara felt a warm presence bloom in her mind. The connection between her and the dragons was not something that could be easily explained to those who had never experienced it. It was deeper than words, a sharing of emotion and intention that transcended normal communication. Lord Theron stood and approached Alara, his aged face creased with concern. He asked what she thought they should do, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Alara replied that they should do something that their people had not done in 3,000 years. They should make contact. They should reach out to these visitors with an open hand rather than a closed fist. The council members looked at her as though she had spoken in a language they did not understand. Making contact meant risk. It meant vulnerability. It meant trusting that these strangers would not see the elves as weak or as something to be conquered and destroyed. But Alara argued that isolation had already failed them. These beings had found their world despite all the precautions and cloaking devices that the elves had put in place over the centuries. They could either meet them with weapons and hostility, which might trigger the exact response they feared, or they could meet them with curiosity and openness, which offered at least the possibility of peaceful exchange. Lady Miriam asked what role the dragons would play. She pointed out that these creatures were powerful and intimidating, and their presence might be seen as a threat rather than a gesture of peaceful intent. Alara had been thinking about this question since the alarms first sounded. She explained that the dragons should be present but restrained. They would not hide because hiding would be dishonest. But they would not attack or threaten. They would simply be there, a living demonstration that the elves had intelligence, power, and the capacity for complex thought. A species that could bond with dragons, truly bond with them as companions and partners rather than masters controlling slaves, had to be capable of more nuanced thinking than simple conquest and destruction. Storm pressed his massive head against Alara's back, and she felt his support flow through their connection. Kess moved forward and began to glow softly, her scales releasing a gentle bioluminescence that filled the chamber with warm light. The council members exchanged glances. They were afraid. Alara could see it in their eyes, but they were also witnessing something that transcended fear. They were seeing the power of connection and trust made visible in the form of two powerful creatures that chose to stand with Alara, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. Lord Theron made a decision. He authorized Alara to lead the first contact team to the neutral zone at the mountain peak, where the visitors would likely land. He chose 5 council representatives to accompany her, each skilled in different aspects of elven knowledge and culture. They would bring gifts that represented their civilization, items that showed craftsmanship and understanding of beauty and meaning. They would bring no weapons, though Alara knew that bringing the dragons was itself a statement about their capabilities and their confidence. As they prepared to depart, Alara took a moment to herself in the crystal garden where she had raised both Kess and Storm from eggs. She remembered finding them in the deep caverns, glowing softly in a nest that appeared to be made from starlight itself. Ancient records suggested that dragons had once lived on this world in numbers beyond counting, but over millennia, they had become rare. Finding 2 eggs had felt like discovering a connection to the past and a promise for the future. She had not known then that these dragons would become her closest companions, and eventually the bridge between worlds. Now she placed her hands on their necks, feeling the warmth of their bodies and the steady pulse of their heartbeats. She told them what she feared and what she hoped. She told them that this moment would define everything that came after, for both their species and for the strangers arriving in the metal vessels. She told them that she trusted them completely, and that she needed them to trust her as well. Both dragons made soft sounds of agreement, and in that moment Alara felt ready to face whatever would come next. Whatever the approaching visitors wanted, whatever they intended, Alara and her dragons would meet them with honesty and hope. The mountain peak was covered in white snow that sparkled under the dual sunlight of Zephyr Prime. Alara stood at the highest point, her silver hair flowing in the wind that swept across the frozen landscape. Beside her, Kess and Storm looked like sentinels guarding the entrance to another world. The council representatives stood in a line behind them, holding the gifts that would represent their civilization. The metal vessels were descending now, their surfaces reflecting the sunlight in strange and beautiful patterns. As the ships approached the landing zone, Alara felt her heart beating faster. This was the moment that would determine everything. She had spent sleepless nights thinking about what might happen, trying to anticipate every possible outcome. What if the visitors were hostile despite her peaceful approach? What if they saw the dragons not as companions but as weapons or threats? What if the council was right to fear contact with the outside world? But she pushed these doubts away and focused on what she could control, her own actions and her commitment to honesty. The first ship landed with a sound like thunder rolling across the mountains. Steam and dust erupted from beneath the vessel, obscuring the landing site temporarily. Alara did not move. She stood firm with her dragons, showing through her stillness that she was not afraid. Storm made a low vocalization that seemed to carry across the wind, not threatening but welcoming. Kess's scales began to glow with patterns of light, creating displays of beauty that seemed almost like a greeting. The boarding ramp descended slowly, and figures began to emerge from the interior of the ship. They were tall, much taller than the elves, with bodies that suggested a different evolutionary history. Their skin had a metallic sheen in some places and was covered with what looked like protective gear in others. They moved with military precision and discipline, forming organized lines as they descended. But what struck Alara most was that they were not immediately drawing weapons or making aggressive moves. They were approaching cautiously, perhaps as wary as she was. The figure at the head of the group was a woman with short dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore symbols on her uniform that appeared to indicate rank and authority. This was someone accustomed to making decisions and commanding others. She stopped when she saw Alara and the dragons, and for a moment everything seemed to pause. The woman studied them carefully, her expression unreadable. Then she began moving forward again, more slowly this time, with her hands clearly visible and empty. Alara took a single step forward to meet her. This action caused the military personnel behind the woman to tense visibly, but their commander raised a hand, signaling them to stay in place. She alone advanced until she was standing just a few meters away from Alara. This close, Alara could see that the woman's eyes were not unkind. They held intelligence and calculation, but also something that looked like respect for Alara's courage in approaching so openly. The woman spoke in a language that Alara did not initially understand. The sounds were complex and layered, produced by a throat architecture different from Elven speech. But Alara had learned long ago that language was only one form of communication. She responded by gesturing toward Kess and Storm, not as a threat but as an introduction. She placed her hand gently on Storm's neck, showing the connection and the calm state of the massive dragon. Storm released a warm exhalation, his breath creating clouds of mist in the cold air. The woman's eyes widened slightly and she spoke again, this time into a communication device on her wrist. Her words were still in her native language, but Alara heard excitement and wonder in her tone. She reached out slowly, deliberately, showing that she meant no harm. When she extended her hand toward Storm, Alara felt the dragon tense slightly, looking to her for approval. Alara gave the slightest nod, and Storm allowed the stranger to touch his snout. The woman's fingers traced the scales carefully, feeling the texture and the warmth. Alara could see amazement in every line of her body. More people emerged from the ship, including several who carried devices that seemed designed for recording and analysis. They kept their distance, respecting the boundary that the commander had established. Alara gestured for the council representatives to come forward with their gifts. They approached carefully, presenting items crafted from the finest materials and most skilled hands in elven society. There were sculptures carved from crystal that caught light in impossible ways. There were textiles woven from materials that shimmered with inner luminescence. There were small devices that served no practical purpose but existed purely to demonstrate the height of elven artistry and craftsmanship. The commander accepted the gifts with obvious pleasure, and she signaled for her own people to bring forward the items they had brought as well. These were different from the elven gifts, more utilitarian and technological in nature, but they too represented the care and intent of the giver. There were metallic objects of gleaming silver and gold. There were data devices containing information about their civilization. There were samples of materials that appeared to contain records of their history and knowledge. As the exchange continued, Kess moved closer to one of the human scientists, seemingly curious about this new form of life. The scientist froze, uncertain how to respond. But Kess simply regarded them with intelligent eyes and then released a soft chirp that sounded almost like amusement. The tension that had been present since the landing began to ease. Alara realized that her dragons were doing what they had always done best. They were opening doors between people that might otherwise remain closed forever. The commander turned back to Alara and spoke slowly, enunciating each sound carefully. Alara did not understand the words themselves, but she understood the intention behind them. This woman wanted to communicate. This woman was willing to make the effort to bridge the gap between their species. Alara responded by taking the commander's hand and placing it on her own heart, then reaching toward the commander and doing the same, showing that they shared the same vital force despite their physical differences. The commander smiled then, a genuine expression of understanding that transcended species and culture. She spoke into her communication device again, and this time her words carried a tone of triumph and hope. The other military personnel began to relax their ready positions. The scientists came forward more openly, eager to observe and study the dragons more closely. What had begun as a moment of potential conflict had transformed into something far more valuable. It had become the beginning of genuine connection. 3 weeks had passed since the initial contact, and the human delegation had been welcomed into the elven city. The visitors had proven themselves to be genuinely interested in peaceful coexistence and mutual learning. The commander, whose name was Captain Victoria, had established temporary quarters within the ancient stone structures of the elven settlement. She had brought with her a small team of specialists, each with different areas of expertise and knowledge. Martha was a biologist and naturalist who had become obsessed with studying the dragons. She spent hours in the caverns where Kess and Storm preferred to rest during the heat of the day. She had brought with her sophisticated equipment that allowed her to measure and analyze the dragon's physiology without causing any harm or discomfort. She studied their bone structure, their scales, their blood chemistry, and their neurological patterns. What she discovered fascinated her beyond measure. The dragons possessed intelligence that rivaled human cognition in certain areas while exceeding it in others. Their brains showed evidence of advanced spatial reasoning and emotional processing that suggested capabilities far beyond simple animal behavior. Derek was a diplomat and scholar who had taken on the responsibility of formal negotiations with the High Council. He worked with Lord Theron and Lady Miriam to understand the history of the elves, their culture, their values, and their previous experiences with other civilizations. Derek asked careful questions and listened intently to the responses, treating every piece of information with respect and genuine interest. He explained to the council that humanity had faced many conflicts throughout its history, but that it had also learned valuable lessons about cooperation and the benefits of peaceful trade. He proposed trade agreements that would allow both species to share resources and knowledge. Louise was a philosopher and cultural expert who had become Ilara's closest companion among the human visitors. She spent afternoons sitting with Ilara and her dragons, discussing everything from the nature of consciousness to the meaning of companionship across biological boundaries. Louise was fascinated by the connection that Ilara shared with Kess and Storm. She wanted to understand how such a bond could exist and what it meant for the philosophy of consciousness and sentience. Ilara explained that the connection was not something that could be fully translated into human language, but that it involved a sharing of emotion, intention, and perspective that transcended normal forms of communication. During one of their sessions, Louise asked Ilara a question that made her think deeply about her own life and experience. Louise asked whether Ilara had ever considered that perhaps the reason she had been drawn to seek contact with the humans was not just a matter of political necessity but something more personal. Perhaps Ilara had always felt that there should be more in the universe than just the elves and the dragons. Perhaps she had sensed that there were others out there worth knowing, worth understanding, worth building relationships with. Ilara considered this carefully and realized that Louise was right. Deep down, beneath all the practical concerns about survival and resource management, Ilara had been lonely. She had wondered what it would be like to meet another species, to share ideas and experiences with beings who had grown up under different stars and evolved through different pressures and circumstances. Storm seemed to understand this conversation on some level. The massive dragon placed his head in Ilara's lap as she spoke, and his eyes held a warmth that seemed to acknowledge her admission of loneliness. Kess curled around both of them, creating a circle of companionship that Louise observed with visible emotion. Louise explained that she believed consciousness and the desire for connection were universal. They were not limited to a single species or biology. Any sufficiently intelligent being would eventually recognize the value of reaching beyond themselves and seeking to understand and connect with others. Captain Victoria called a formal meeting between the human delegation and the High Council. The purpose was to begin drafting the first written agreement between the two civilizations. The documents would outline terms of trade, mutual defense, scientific cooperation, and cultural exchange. The humans proposed that a joint research station be established in a neutral zone where both species could work together on problems of mutual concern. The elves suggested that human scientists be allowed to study the dragons more closely, with the understanding that the dragons themselves would have the right to refuse participation in any studies that made them uncomfortable. This proposal sparked discussion about the nature of dragon sentience and their rights as individuals. Martha had already gathered enough data to suggest that the dragons possessed consciousness and self-awareness comparable to the most intelligent human specimens. This raised profound ethical questions about how they should be treated and what protections they should be given. Ilara argued strongly that the dragons should be recognized as persons under the law, with the same protections and rights as any other sapient being. Storm and Kess were not property or experimental subjects. They were individuals who happened to choose to remain with her because they valued their relationship, not because they were compelled to do so. Lord Theron made a proposal that surprised everyone in the chamber. He suggested that the new agreement between the two species should include formal recognition of the dragons as sapient beings with full legal standing. He proposed that Kess and Storm be allowed to participate in diplomatic discussions if they wished to do so, and that their input be considered equally valid as that of any other participant. He even suggested that the dragons might eventually develop their own representatives and form their own delegations to participate in future negotiations. Captain Victoria found this proposal not only acceptable but fascinating. She explained that in human legal history, there had been many struggles to extend rights to different groups and species. Recognizing the dragons as sapient and granting them legal personhood seemed not just right but necessary, given what the evidence showed about their capabilities. She committed to advocating for this position when she returned to human space, to report her findings to higher authorities. As the meeting concluded, Alara felt a sense of rightness settle over the chamber. This was what she had hoped for all along, not just survival or trade, but genuine recognition of all sentient beings as worthy of dignity, respect, and the opportunity to shape their own futures. Storm released a low vocalization that seemed to carry approval, and Cass added her own harmonious note to his sound. The humans in the chamber fell silent, listening to the dragons speak in their own language. Martha was recording everything, capturing both audio and visual data. She would have so much to share with the human scientific community about this moment. The warning came without announcement, a sudden spike in the sensor readings that sent alarm through both the human and elven monitoring stations. A massive solar storm was building on one of the twin suns, and its trajectory suggested that it would impact Zephyr Prime within days. The magnetic disturbances would be catastrophic for any unshielded technology. The human research station, which relied on sophisticated equipment and power systems, would be destroyed. The elven settlements, which used more analog systems based on crystal technology, would still suffer significant damage to their ancient power sources and communication networks. Captain Victoria called an emergency meeting with the High Council and the Joint Research Team. The situation was dire, and conventional solutions would not work. The human shields were designed to protect against normal solar radiation, but not against a storm of this magnitude. The elven crystal arrays could distribute some of the electromagnetic energy harmlessly into the ground, but not enough to prevent widespread damage. Working separately, both species would suffer terrible losses. Scientists would die. Communication systems would fail. The carefully constructed peace between the two civilizations would be severely tested, perhaps broken entirely if either side felt that the other had abandoned them in a moment of crisis. Alara stood in the center of the council chamber, aware that all eyes were upon her. She could feel Storm and Kess beside her, both dragons focused and alert despite the stressful situation. She began to think out loud, speaking slowly and carefully. She explained that the elves had ancient knowledge about stellar manipulation, techniques that had been lost to most of the galaxy, but preserved in elven records and oral traditions. These techniques involved using natural planetary magnetic fields to deflect or redirect solar radiation. The process required precise timing and perfect coordination. It was dangerous and had not been attempted in thousands of years. But it might work. Martha spoke up immediately, asking what she could do to help. She explained that human technology and elven knowledge, combined and working in harmony, might accomplish what neither species could achieve alone. She suggested that the human technical team work with the elven scholars to understand the old deflection techniques and then adapt them using modern equipment and systems. The combination of ancient wisdom and modern innovation might be exactly what was needed to protect both civilizations. Derek began drafting the operational plan immediately. He identified the key experts from both species who would need to work together. Engineers, physicists, scholars, and strategists would form working teams assigned to different aspects of the problem. The largest team would focus on the deflection mechanism itself, while others would handle power distribution, safety systems, and contingency planning. He proposed that the operation be coordinated from a central command center, where both human and elven coordinators could communicate in real time. Lord Theron proposed something even bolder. He suggested that both human and elven personnel work directly alongside each other in the field, not separated but integrated into mixed teams. This would require translation technology and careful coordination, but it would also demonstrate the commitment of both species to the goal of mutual survival. The humans agreed without hesitation. Captain Victoria saw this as an opportunity to show that true cooperation meant more than just formal agreements and trade deals. It meant putting lives at stake together in service of a common cause. Alara volunteered to lead the primary deflection team personally. Storm and Kess would accompany her. She explained that the dragons might be able to sense magnetic and electromagnetic disturbances in ways that human instruments could not. Their unique physiology and neural architecture might allow them to perceive the solar storm in ways that would help the team fine-tune their responses and timing. Captain Victoria agreed to this plan, assigning Martha and Derek to work directly with Alara and the dragons. The next 3 days were a blur of intense work and preparation. The deflection mechanism was constructed on the highest mountain peak, a structure that combined elven crystal technology with human metallic conducting systems. The device looked like a massive array of interlocking geometric shapes, each component carefully calibrated and positioned. Teams worked in shifts, never stopping for more than brief moments to rest. Both human and elven workers pushed themselves to the edge of exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that their species depended on the success of this operation. As the solar storm approached, the sky began to change. The normal blue faded to shades of orange and red as the incoming radiation began to affect the upper atmosphere. Lightning-like displays of energy began to illuminate the night sky, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Storm released a deep vocalization that seemed to resonate with the energy patterns in the air around them. Kess's scales began to glow brighter, her bioluminescence pulsing in synchronization with the approaching electromagnetic waves. Martha noticed something remarkable happening. The dragons seemed to be responding to the magnetic disturbances in real time, their body chemistry and neural patterns adjusting to match the incoming energy patterns. She recorded everything, aware that she was witnessing something profound and important. The dragons were not just sensing the storm, they were in some way harmonizing with it, finding ways to exist in balance with forces that should have been destructive to organic life. Alara guided her teams through the final activation sequence. Human technicians worked alongside elven crystal masters, each bringing their own expertise and perspective to the task. The deflection mechanism began to hum, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The magnetic field around the planet began to shift and strengthen, guided by the careful adjustments being made by the integrated teams. Then the solar storm hit. The impact of the incoming energy was like a physical force that seemed to push against the entire planet. But the deflection mechanism held firm. The massive waves of radiation were caught by the augmented magnetic field and bent away from the world, diverted into space in harmless trajectories. The human monitoring stations reported that their equipment remained functional. The elven crystal arrays showed no signs of damage or degradation. The operation had worked perfectly. As the immediate danger passed and the storm continued its journey through space, both humans and elves emerged from their stations and shelters to look at the sky. The orange and red hues were fading, replaced by the normal blue of day and the light of the twin suns. But everything had changed. What had once been two separate species on a shared world had now become something new. They had faced death together and survived together. They had worked as one integrated force in service of survival. They were no longer strangers who had agreed to coexist. They were allies who had tested their alliance in fire and found it strong. The formal treaty signing ceremony took place in the grand chamber of the Elven City, a space carved from living crystal that had existed for over 10,000 years. The chamber was vast, with walls that seemed to contain entire universes of light and shadow. Delegations from both species gathered around the central platform where the agreement would be signed and witnessed. This was not just another document, though the physical papers and digital records would be important. This was a moment that would reshape the future of both civilizations. Alara stood with Kess and Storm on either side of her, both dragons adorned with ceremonial crystals that reflected light in patterns of extraordinary beauty. The dragons were not merely decorations or symbols, though they certainly served that purpose. They were full participants in this moment, their presence itself a statement about the new order being established. Lord Theron and Lady Miriam sat in the highest positions, representing the elven authority and legitimacy. Captain Victoria stood opposite them with Martha, Derek, and Louise beside her, representing human civilization in all its complexity and hope. The ceremony began with words of acknowledgement and gratitude. Lord Theron spoke first, offering thanks to the human visitors for approaching with open hearts and genuine desire for understanding, rather than conquest. He acknowledged that fear and suspicion had nearly prevented this moment, but that Alara's courage had opened a door that could never again be closed. Lady Miriam added words about the dragons, explaining that their recognition as sapient beings was not merely a legal matter, but a recognition of truths that had always existed. The dragons had always been persons. The law was finally catching up to reality. Captain Victoria spoke next, her words carefully chosen and delivered with genuine emotion. She explained that humanity had learned through bitter experience that isolation led to misunderstanding, and that misunderstanding led to conflict. She spoke of wars that could have been prevented through communication, of resources wasted on weapons that could have been used to build cooperation. She stated that this day represented humanity's commitment to a different path, a path where meeting the unknown was met with curiosity rather than fear, with openness rather than hostility. She pledged that humanity would honor the agreement not just in letter but in spirit, with genuine respect for the elves and the dragons as full partners in building something new. Martha stepped forward and read from a scientific report that documented the intelligence and sentience of the dragons. She described the neural patterns, the behavioral complexity, the evidence of abstract thought and emotional intelligence that demonstrated beyond doubt that these creatures were persons in the fullest sense of that word. She stated that science itself demanded that they be recognized as such. Derek spoke about the economic benefits that cooperation between the two civilizations would bring to both. Trade agreements would allow each species to access resources that were rare or absent in their own territories. Scientific collaboration would accelerate progress in both human and elven understanding of the universe. Louise offered final words about meaning and connection, speaking about how the meeting of two species across the stars offered profound lessons about the nature of consciousness and the universal desire for understanding and belonging. Alara stepped forward. When all the formal speakers had concluded, she held the treaty document in her hands and looked at the assembled crowd of both humans and elves. She spoke with clarity and conviction, her voice carrying through the chamber without needing amplification. She said that this day was not an ending but a beginning. The real work of building cooperation and understanding would happen in the days and years and decades to come. There would be challenges and difficulties. There would be moments when misunderstanding threatened to undo what had been built. But having come this far, having survived and cooperated through crisis, she was confident that both species possessed the will and the wisdom to overcome whatever obstacles arose. She placed her hand on Storm's neck and then on Kess's neck, making her final point with gesture rather than words. The dragons symbolized what was possible when different beings chose connection over isolation, trust over fear, cooperation over conflict. They embodied the truth that companionship and understanding could transcend all boundaries of biology and species in history. Then she signed the treaty, her name written in flowing elven script that had been refined over thousands of years. Captain Victoria signed next, her handwriting bold and clear in human characters. Lord Theron and Lady Miriam added their seals, ancient symbols of elven authority and authenticity. Storm released a vocalization that seemed to fill the entire chamber with harmonics that human ears could barely perceive but could certainly feel vibrating through their bones. Kess added her own voice to his, the two dragons creating a duet that seemed to acknowledge and celebrate the moment. Many of the assembled witnesses, both human and elven, felt tears forming in their eyes. This was not just the signing of a treaty. This was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Zephyr Prime. The celebration that followed lasted for hours. Humans and elves mingled, sharing food and drink, communicating in whatever ways they could manage. Martha and Derek found themselves in conversation with several elven scholars, discussing everything from stellar navigation to agricultural techniques. Louise sat with Alara and several elven philosophers, exploring questions of meaning and existence. The dragons moved through the chamber, accepting attention and respect from both species, seemingly enjoying the recognition of their personhood and their role in creating this historic moment. As the celebration began to wind down, Alara found herself alone in a quiet corner of the chamber with Storm and Kess. Captain Victoria joined her there, having slipped away from the crowd. She looked at the dragons with evident admiration and asked Alara something that had been on her mind since they first met. She asked how it was possible to achieve such complete trust and understanding with another being. Alara considered the question carefully before answering. She explained that trust was not something that could be demanded or forced. It was offered freely by both parties because each believed that the other meant well and would honor the commitment they made. It required vulnerability and the willingness to risk disappointment. It required choosing to see the best in another being even when fear suggested otherwise. Captain Victoria thanked Alara for all that she had done to make this moment possible. She explained that history would remember this day as the moment when humanity and elvenkind chose to forge a bond instead of a conflict. She said that Alara's name would be remembered not just by elves but by humans as well, as the one who had the vision and courage to believe that peace was possible. Alara replied that she had not done this alone. She had done it with the support and wisdom of her people, with the open hearts of the human visitors, and most of all with the companionship and trust of two dragons who had believed in her, when believing was difficult. Storm and Kess pressed close to her then, and all four of them stood together in the quiet moment, aware that they had been part of something profound and important, something that would echo through time and shape the future for generations yet to come.